Good morning and congratulations if you have made it this far. You have completed the book of Genesis. So that's really exciting stuff. Good job. Way to hang in there. Um, so today we just are going to wrap it all up with a story of Jesus, actually. A really well-known story that you have read hundreds of times and loved. And when you read it now, having kind of plodded through the book of Genesis, you're going to go, whoa, I had no idea that all that was behind it. So let's just jump in. This is the story in Luke chapter 15, if you want to turn there. And I'll read the whole thing. And it's the story that we commonly title The Prodigal Son. Then Jesus said, "There was a man who had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, 'Father, give me the share of the property that will belong to me.' So he divided his property between them." Now, right away, when you hear a story about 2 sons, 2 brothers, and the younger of the 2 sort of weasels his way already into the blessing that's coming to him, your ears should perk up a little bit. What kind of story are we dealing with here? A few days later, the younger son gathered all he had and traveled to a distant country, and there he squandered his property in dissolute living. When he had spent everything, a severe famine took place throughout that country, and he began to be in need. So he went and he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, who sent him to the fields to feed the pigs. He would gladly have filled himself with the pods that the pigs were eating, and no one gave him anything. But when he came to himself, he said, "How many of my father's hired hands have bread enough to spare? But here I am, dying of hunger. I will get up and go to my father, and I will say to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Treat me like one of your hired hands.' So he set off and went to his father. But while he was still far off, his father saw him, and filled with compassion, he ran and put his arms around him and kissed him. Then the son said to him, 'Father, I have sinned against heaven and before you. I am no longer worthy to be called your son.' But the father said to his slaves, 'Quickly bring out a robe, the best one,'" remember the robe, "'and put it on him. Put a ring on his finger and sandals on his feet, and get the fatted calf and kill it, and let us celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and alive again. He was lost and is found.' And they began to celebrate. Now his elder son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. He called one of the slaves and asked what was going on. The slave replied, 'Your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf because he has got him back safe and sound.' Then the older son became angry and refused to go in. His father came out and began to plead with him, but he answered his father, 'Listen, for all these years I have been working like a slave for you. I have never disobeyed your command, yet you have never given me even a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. But when this son of yours comes back, who has devoured your property with prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him.' Then the father said to him, 'Son, you are always with me, and all that is mine is yours. But we had to celebrate and rejoice because this brother of yours was dead and has come to life. He was lost and has been found.'" So what kind of story is this? You should recognize this form right away. This is a jealous brother story, just like the one that we've seen all throughout Genesis. Uh, in fact, I want to suggest that this story is Jesus's very insightful, short and compact commentary on the whole book of Genesis. Let me give you an example of what I'm talking about. So, how did the younger son find himself um, where he was, starving to death, out feeding the pigs and wishing that he could eat the slop he was feeding the pigs? How did he find himself in that situation? Well, if you're like me, your immediate answer is, well, he squandered his inheritance, right? He wasted everything that he had in desolate living. Uh, I suspect that you answered that way because that's how most people in America answer that question. Uh, there is a professor of New Testament named Mark Allen Powell who um, teaches mostly here in the States, in Minnesota, and he also has had occasion for various lengths of time to teach in Tanzania, in South Africa. I'm sorry, in East Africa, and um, in Russia. And he does this little experiment. He has his students read that parable and then write out all of the details of the parable, everything they can remember. And then he asks the question, how did this son end up in this situation where he's feeding the pigs and he's starving to death and hoping that he can eat their slop? And all of his American students answers just the way that I did. Well, because he squandered his inheritance. Interestingly, his Russian students forget that part of the story, and they answer that he finds himself hungry because there's a famine in the land. Did you even catch that line in the story, or did you forget it, like the Russian students forgot that he squandered his living? It's one line in the story, but so is the squandering. You see, our context informs the way we read. And so one of the lessons of this little anecdote is that paying attention as we read is really important because our context is going to drive us to certain things. Our Western, individualized, sort of go it alone kind of mentality makes us think about squandering and responsibility. Well, his African students sometimes miss both of these lines, and they remember that no one gave him anything to eat. Also a line in the story. Isn't that interesting? So how did the boy come to this place where he was starving to death, wishing to eat the slop he was feeding the pigs? Well, there was a personal issue, an issue that he was grasping at things that didn't belong to him. He's asking for this inheritance before he was ready for it, before he was ready to have the responsibility for it. And he, as a result, wasted and squandered it. There was also a social problem. No one helped out this young man who was in need, who was starving. No one gave him anything to eat. There was no social safety net to catch someone who had fallen through the cracks. And there was a cosmic problem. There was famine in the land. There was some thing happening in the heavens, as it were, that no one sort of had any control over, whether there was rain or not. So, all three of these things are at play. Remember back when we were talking about the mythic portions of the book of Genesis, way back at the beginning, before we got to any of those jealous brother stories? We said, what's gone wrong here? We started with this beautiful temple mountain garden, and suddenly everything goes awry. What has gone wrong? Well, there were three things, remember? Adam and Eve were grasping at things that did not belong to them. They were trying to take for themselves that divine authority to name good and bad. And on a social level, the people of Babylon, building the Tower of Babylon, came together around their new technology and their single universal language to try to build uh, this fake cosmic mountain, build their way up to heaven, reunite heaven and earth on their own terms as a society. And so God dealt with that problem on a social basis, scattering the people and confusing their language. And we saw there was a very strange cosmic problem. There were these sons of God, these divine beings, watchers, um, who were trying to reunite heaven and earth on their own terms by taking for themselves wives from among the daughters of human beings. So there you have it. Personal, social, and cosmic levels to the problem. And Jesus sets this up in the same way just before he tells this jealous brother story. So Jesus' story is also about exile and return. If you remember, we started our discussion of Genesis with a discussion of the Babylonian exile. The people of Israel were, the temple was destroyed, Jerusalem was destroyed, and the people were taken into captivity in Babylon from whence they wrote this book. Well, it was only a couple hundred years before the time of Jesus that the people had returned from exile in Babylon back to the Jewish homeland in Palestine. And so Jesus tells this story about the younger son who had weaseled his way into the blessing. This is very clearly a type of Israel, of this people. Just like Jacob, just like Isaac, the younger son had been blessed. And so Jesus tells the story of this younger son having received the blessing, going off into exile, into Gentile territory, very clearly symbolized by the pig farming, right? This was swine were considered an unclean animal to the Jewish people. You never would have had pig farms in Jewish territory. So he's clearly off in exile in Gentile lands, and then he returns home. But the parables are meant to be a little bit annoying. This is the way parables work. They're told to get under your skin. So it's about exile and return. But has this young man, has the change that results in the return of exile really come about, right? Has he repented of his sins, for instance? Well, it's interesting. The young man comes to his senses. He doesn't say to himself, "Oh, I never should have taken my father's property. I never should have reached out and grabbed for myself that which didn't belong to me yet." Uh, he just says, "I'm hungry, and there are servants in my father's house who are better off than I am." This is not repentance, it's cost benefit analysis. And we even get the sense that the young man is a little bit disingenuous in his speech, right? Remember, the whole thing is supposed to be about, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as a slave in your house. But he starts the whole speech off with, Father, I am no longer worthy to be called your son. He presumes that relationship that he's saying he no longer has. So there's already a sense here that this return from exile thing isn't quite what you think it is. And Jesus tells this story with these kind of biting details in that way to make you go, I don't like that. To make the original hearers say, I don't like the way he's telling that. Now, notice we call this story the story of the prodigal son. We say that it's about the younger son in our titling. Those titles, by the way, are not original, they're added to the text much later. Um, so, in our titling, we make the story about the younger son. But the story seems, on just a bare reading of it, to be about the father. That is, in fact, how it starts out. If you just open the text, it's once there was a father who had two sons. Um, and if you look at where Luke has placed this story in the narrative, um, it fits after a number of stories, or two other stories, of people losing things. So there is a shepherd who has 100 sheep and loses one of the sheep, and then goes off, leaves the other 99, and goes off to find it. Then there's a woman who has 10 coins, and she loses one, and she cleans her whole house and tears everything apart, trying to find that lost coin. And then we get to this story, about what should be appropriately titled, I think, The Lost Son. It's about a father who's lost a son and goes looking for him. But the really interesting thing that Jesus is playing with in this kind of jealous brother story motif that we know so well from Genesis, that all of his hearers would have known so well from Genesis, is which son is lost, right? Again, this is meant to be a story that gets under your skin, that gets a little bit annoying, that bothers you. And so telling this story to the people of Israel, as Jesus did, as his all of his teaching and preaching was done to the people of Israel. He tells a story about the people of Israel, the younger son going off into exile and returning, and yet there's another son, that God has other children, and perhaps it is that other child who has really been lost. Maybe the return from exile is a moment, an opportunity to invite the older son, to invite the nations. Remember, Abraham is called out from among the nations. Israel is this younger son called out from among the nations, just like Joseph is chosen, given a robe from among his 12 brothers. And so maybe the son who's gotten lost, who the father forgot to keep track of, is this older son who's been there all along. Maybe Luke is placing this story in the way that it is, so that Jesus is asking his hearers to expand their understanding of who are God's children. So maybe the exile and return is occasion for the older son to be invited to the party. But the question, of course, is whether the older son is going to realize that the party is going on and come in and join the celebrations, right? It's interesting in a couple of ways. It's interesting because Jesus seems to be saying that God has these other children who have always been among the Father, right? That these other children, that Jesus isn't doing something new in inviting this Gentile mission, in creating space for lots of other people to be called the children of God within the system. But these children of God have always been there, and we've just failed to recognize it. But at the same time, he's also saying that these children themselves have failed to recognize that they have been a part of the party. These other children, these Gentiles, these lost ones, have failed to recognize that they have been a part of the party, right? So we have this sense from way back in the Abraham story, right? Remember, Abraham is is called why? He's blessed. Why? Not that he himself should be blessed, but that through you all the nations of the world will be blessed. Jesus said this picture of two brothers together celebrating, not killing one another, not exiling one another, but together celebrating, um, partying together. This is the story that Genesis has been telling all along, and we just need to recognize it, right? It's a little bit like saying, as Revelation says, that the gates of heaven have always been open to you. That the two brothers just need to enter together. It's a bit like saying, as Jesus says in just a couple chapters later in Luke, that when the Pharisees say, when is this kingdom of God that you keep talking about going to come? And Jesus says, oh, no, it's not coming in a way that you can see and pinpoint. The kingdom is in you. It is among you. The party has always been going on. All you had to do was walk in the door. Which takes us all the way back, doesn't it, to Genesis chapter 1, in which the writer says to these people who have been exiled, who have lost their temple, who have no place to worship, who sit down by the rivers of Babylon and weep, for how can they sing the songs of Zion, of the temple of Jerusalem in a foreign land? And the writer says to them, no, you don't get it. The whole thing, the whole world is a temple. So this cosmic temple mountain, everything you see, the kingdom is among you. The party has always been going on. You just had to pay attention. So that's it. That's Jesus's beautiful, wonderful, very compact, and very incisive commentary on the book of Genesis. You'll never read that story the same way again. So, I think where we are headed next is to look at some of the letters of the Apostle Paul. Paul, as you know, is attributed with about 13 letters in the New Testament. Lots, a big chunk of what is the New Testament. We are going to look at some of those, I think, about 6 of them, or 7 of them, and I'll tell you why when we get to it, why we're only looking at those 7. But that seems like a lot. That's a lot of books, but it's really about the same word count-wise as the book of Genesis. If we work through all of Paul's letters, Genesis is really long. So that is the plan. I'm going to take a couple of weeks off. I've got vacation coming up and just need to do a little bit of studying before we get ready to that. So take probably the rest of July off and in terms of doing these Bible studies. And then in August, we'll jump back in with Paul's letters. And I'm not sure what the format of that will look like. If it'll be just like this, or maybe we'll join together on Zoom or something else. So we can talk about that more as the month wears on. So thank you so much. I really, really appreciate your plodding with me through this book of Genesis. It's been a lot of fun for me to take a deep dive into this book, and I hope that you have enjoyed it as well and have learned a few things along the way. So take care, and I will see you soon.